Hey, Father James here again at Our Lady of Mercy in Aurora, where I'm parochial vicar, and I've got one more thing for you again today. So, in my first video, I explained a little bit about the Companions of Christ, what it is, and now I'd like to share with you a little bit about how we actually got started, what is the history behind this whole thing, and why it would have ever come into my head to pursue the Companions of Christ. So, a little bit of, and this way you also get to know a little bit more about me. So I went to college seminary up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it was at St. John Vianney College Seminary up there. And while I was up there, it was a very, very beautiful and blessed time of my life. And one of the ways in which it was able to transform me and really shape me and help me to grow into the priest that I am today and to prepare me for future ministry was all of these different supports and methods that were utilized at the seminary. So first of all, as soon as we showed up, we got put into fraternal groups or support groups. And so what we were asked to do is, with these other three random guys who were also thinking about the priesthood, about 18 to 22, right, college guys, from throughout the entire country, really just kind of just met them more or less, but got to know each other over time. We asked to share with each other our graces, like all the good things that were happening to us in our life, what things were going on, and all of our struggles. So being vulnerable with each other and saying, well, this is a difficulty, this is something that I'm dealing with, that I'm trying to work on, etc. And then also that then after, sharing those things, we would be able to hold each other accountable to making sure that we're getting in our prayer every day, that we're showing up to prayer on time with the community, that we're studying well, and that we're ultimately growing in holiness. And the kind of motto behind this, that the rector or the priest who was in charge of the seminary at the time, he called it living in the light. Sharing your struggles with your in these support groups, sharing my struggles with my brothers during this time, bringing them into the light so that the light of Christ can shine on them, and then allow Jesus to continue to work on them through my brothers, rather than just kind of keeping it isolated or in the dark or something, as it would be said. Another thing that was at the seminary was there was a culture of intentional fraternity. So it was very commonplace for guys to say, hey, would you like to grab lunch today, or would you like to get dinner together sometime, or whatever, and to spend that time, those one-on-one meals, getting to know the other guy. So where'd you grow up? How many siblings did you have? And then also how things are going now. How are your studies going? How's formation going? Etc. And so it was just normal to not only seek out and try to intentionally get to know the other person, but then and to build friendships, but then also to have a culture of affirmation. So trying to intentionally affirm each other, to find the good in your brothers and to point that out. And then also on top of that, right, as you're sharing and growing, knowing that my brother supports me, he cares about me, right, he desires to get to know me, he affirms me, so also he can hold me accountable and fraternally correct me, such that that can be a normal thing in the seminary, such that we all feel comfortable pointing it out. Hey, I noticed that you were sleeping in holy hour today, and you've done that for the last 5 days. Have you been getting enough sleep lately? Maybe you should try to go to bed earlier, or something like that. So that just kind of being a culture that was built into the seminary. Likewise, that every day we would be forced into the chapel, as I've said in my homily before, 6:15 every day for a holy hour and for silent adoration. And that seeking virtue and seeking holiness was what the goal of the seminary was. Whether or not you were called to become a priest, or you were called to marriage or religious life or whatever it might be, The goal was to grow in holiness, to grow closer to Christ, and to ultimately make a gift of yourself in whatever way the Lord is calling you to. So at St. John Vianney Seminary up in St. Paul, Minnesota, this was the culture. And I thought nothing of it. I thought all seminaries were like this. Most of them are to a lot of extent, but SJV is very special in this way in a lot of these particulars. And it was very beautiful. But at the same time, while I was going through college seminary, and even through major seminary after that, as it's called, up at Mundelein, I noticed that there were a lot of newly ordained priests who were leaving the priesthood. They had gone to SJV or other seminaries. 8 years of study, 8 years of prayer and formation, and they'd become a priest, and like that's everything that you'd been waiting for and hoping for, and then they just seemed to leave. And that was very shocking to me, right? So as a college seminarian, where I'm thinking this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, and there's all this preparation, all these beautiful things going on at St. John Vianney College Seminary, but then why would guys be leaving? And so that forced me then to ask the question, well, if I'm, going to the same seminaries, if I'm perhaps even growing up in the same town or have a similar background to these guys and having the same formation, well, why do I think I would be different? Why do I think I wouldn't face the same difficulties? Because I know I'm broken, I know I'm imperfect, right? And I wouldn't assume that these guys are necessarily like more broken than myself. So what's the deal? Why would I be different? Well, of course I knew that, yes, I had to rely on Christ, that he had to be the center of this vocation, that it couldn't be about me, it couldn't be about money, which is a funny thing because we don't make a lot of money. But, it had to be centered around Christ, of course, and I had to keep my relationship with Christ central, primary, priority, etc., and that I had to rely on him. But then also, that Christianity, I knew, wasn't meant to be lived alone. Jesus gives us many visible support systems in order to help us to grow in the faith together. So you can even just think of the family. Family life is literally meant to be a little domestic church, such that that small community of Christians can support each other, hold each other accountable, build each other up, and ultimately help each other to grow towards Christ. And just as Jesus, with his 12 apostles, he formed a little community, and that community of brothers was able to support each other and whatnot. So I knew that these things were true, that I needed to stay close to Christ, but also that he desires to give community as a way of support. So I thought back to SJV, and what I realized is that, well, a lot of the priests on staff at St. John Vianney College Seminary, where I went, were these priests called Companions of Christ priests. The rector who was in charge of it, a bunch of the spiritual directors, a bunch of the formators, as they're called, priests who would just help guys, were all companions. Not all of them, and some of them who weren't companions were very holy and good priests, but nevertheless, a lot of them were. And as I started to learn a little bit more about, well, what is this Companions of Christ thing? And so I read the St. Paul Rule, and learning a little bit more about what that is and what that looks like, I realized that all those structures, all those things that I loved about St. John Vianney, the fraternal groups, the sharing, the accountability, the culture of intentional fraternity and friendship, and affirming each other, and those one-on-one meals, and regular silent prayer and adoration and holy hour, and ultimately seeking holiness and virtue together, well, that's what the Companions of Christ seeks to do. So seeing that connection and seeing these companions priests who were very holy and very happy and very healthy in their priesthood, I thought, well, perhaps that's for me too. At the time, so this going back to now, I enter Mundelein Seminary for major seminary, and that's where I found out that not all seminaries are the same, because there weren't communal holy hours where we were all forced into the chapel at the same time. Mundelein Seminary is major, so it's like graduate school, and there are guys not just from 18 to 22, but of all ages. And so in a lot of ways, you're just expected, you're an adult, so if you're going to pray, you're going to have a prayer life, do it yourself, right? Good. Take the training wheels off a little bit, but it wasn't built into the culture in the same way. And so I realized that, okay, this isn't a universal thing, and that not all diocesan priesthood is lived with this kind of intentional fraternity in the exact same way. And so while praying about this and thinking, well, I feel like the Lord is calling me to perhaps pursue this way of life or something akin to the Companions of Christ for my priesthood so that I can have that support, continue on the good things that I received at St. John Vianney College Seminary. And what I found out is that I wasn't the only one thinking about this. The Holy Spirit, through Father Stephen Borello, put myself, Father Michael Groth, who was in my class, and then two other guys who were 2 years ahead of me in seminary at Mundelein. All four of us were at Mundelein together. We were all thinking the exact same thing. We had all gone to St. John Vianney. We all had the same desire to kind of live this way of life, and we're thinking, well, maybe this can happen in the Diocese of Joliet as well. So, providentially, we were brought together by Father Stephen Borello because we each voiced this to him individually, and he said, these other three guys are thinking about it too, and we're like, what? So he put us together, we talked about it, and little did we know that year, right as we got together, he also told us, oh, and by the way, there's a priest who's a Companion of Christ from Denver, Colorado, who's here, living at Mundelein, studying right now. He's here just for a year. He happens to be here this year, and actually he was in charge of the companions over there and is currently their in charge of teaching and forming and growing companions in other dioceses. So, like, oh, well, that's convenient, clearly divine providence. And so we connected with Father Matt Book from Denver, Colorado, who is studying and living at Mundelein, and he said, yes, I would love to help you out. Every week, every other week, he would get together, share a meal with us, and just teach us about the life so that we could continue discerning, well, how would we bring this to the Diocese of Joliet? What would that look like? What does the Companions of Christ actually look like? What about all of these difficulties that we think of? So you just slowly and patiently walked with us through that. And so we were able to get the ball rolling with the diocese. So during that year, we brought and proposed the idea to Bishop Conlin at the time. And he said, well, sounds like a good idea. But obviously it doesn't just happen magically. You gotta get all the paperwork filled out and answer all these questions about the difficulties of, well, if you're gonna be living in community together, well then what about assignments and how are those gonna work and whatnot? And I answer some of those questions in the other video. So nevertheless, for the next 4 years then, we worked with our diocese, with Bishop Conlin. We had multiple more meetings and whatnot to hammer out a lot of those details and to figure out what needs to happen and what would it actually look like if we implement the St. Paul and the Denver Companions of Christ in the Diocese of Joliet. We were right on the cusp of being formally established, and part of one of the things that Bishop Conlin wanted for the four of us, because we were seminarians at the time, right, was that we be ordained first, such that we would already be ordained ministers. We had already shown our commitment to the church and to the diocesan ministry before we added on this secondary thing, right, because we're diocesan priests first as companions and companions second. So we desired that we be ordained first. So Father Max and Father Mike were ordained priests, and then soon after myself and now Father Michael Groth were ordained deacons. And so we were ready to go, and we were finishing up the last things on the paperwork of getting it formally established and recognized by the diocese, such that then we could have a 501c3 status and things like that that would be connected, which is almost just pushed through, recognized through and under the Diocese of Joliet and all those things. And Bishop Conlon goes on a leave, and we think, okay, well, now what's going to happen? We're just going to have to wait, because we'd already been waiting 4 years of working this out. But lo and behold, God sends us Bishop Pates, who from Iowa, and we think, well, who's this guy? We don't really know much about him. Pope Francis calls him out of retirement and into the Diocese of Joliet. But providentially, Bishop Pates, before being a bishop in Des Moines, Iowa, was actually an auxiliary bishop in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he grew up in St. Paul. And so he knew the Companions of Christ very well, because he not only lived amongst them as a fellow priest in that diocese, but also was a bishop over them and had to deal with a lot of the logistics and what does this mean and what does this look like, etc. And he was very favorable towards them. In fact, he said that back then when he was auxiliary in St. Paul, there was one point where the archbishop, right, so the bishop who's right above him, right, as him being auxiliary or help bishop, sat him down one day and he's like, Bishop Pates, if the Companions of Christ had come to me and asked me to establish them, to make them a thing, they proposed this idea to me, I probably honestly would have said no, because there seemed like there's a lot of difficulties, like this whole living in residence and community together and all these other things, just like, do the normal diocesan priest thing. But I didn't have to make that decision, the Archbishop said. He said, I inherited, my predecessor did establish the Companions in St. Paul, and so I inherited them, and now I don't know what I would do without them. So that obviously made a very big impact on Bishop Pates, who's hearing that from his boss, who's them together are working with and the Companions and whatnot. So lo and behold, so many years later, he ends up in the Diocese of Joliet, and we come forward to him and say, Bishop Pates, we've been working with Bishop Conlon in the diocese for 4 years. We're trying to establish this thing called the Companions of Christ. And he's like, I know exactly what that is. I love it. I want to support it. And so he was able to help us to finally get through the last paperwork to become formally established. So we're, of course, very grateful for God sending us Bishop Pates, for God helping us in and through Bishop Conlon and his great support, and the vocations directors at the time while we were going throughout seminary, who were very supportive and helpful in trying to encourage us and get us to pursue what seemed so far off, like a dream or something that would be very difficult to try to introduce. But nevertheless, here we are. So on May 1st of 2020, the Companions of Christ was established as the third iteration of the Companions of Christ in the world, here in the Diocese of Joliet. So it's myself, Father Michael Groth, Father Mike McMahon, and Father Max Bena, who are the founders, and God willing, if other priests of the Diocese of Joliet desire to join, they are more than welcome to discern whether or not they are called to this way of life, of living out the diocesan priesthood as well. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that you all are doing well during this pandemic and whatnot. And in the other video, if you haven't already seen that, I describe a little bit more about what the Companions of Christ is exactly. So thank you very much, and God bless.